Socciarelli, please keep me
On track.
on track, okay? If you need to turn me around and go a different direction, please do. I guess the first thing you need to understand is there has been and still is and probably always will be a lack of standardization with this family of instruments. The lack of standardization has to do with the range of the various instruments as well as the nomenclature that you would encounter in a part or a score. So you need to keep that in mind. The second thing that I think is really valuable to have at your fingertips or in your hip pocket so you can whip it out when you need it is I like to use the approach that one would use if you studied all the famous music that's ever been composed. And after having done that, you'll arrive at a list of functions. Why did composers use the instruments that they used? And how did they use them? So I call this the functions of percussion. Come in. Some of you should know this. They are. The oldest one is rhythm. Now that generic title is meant to be all-inclusive, so that includes time, pulse, groove, all those things that have to do with rhythm. The second function of percussion, probably historically, as far as classical music would be concerned, would be color. And as you already guessed or already know, no other family of instruments compares to this particular family of instruments. It literally is an orchestra, a percussion orchestra. So we have rhythm, color. Next, Beethoven was the first to do this, thematic. And he did it with the timpani. But imagine what you could do with the xylophone, the bells, etc. Next, special effects. And boy, we have a bunch of those. What do we have so far? 4? Mm-hmm. Another one is articulation. Some composers use this function, knowingly or unknowingly, not necessarily as a unison, okay, but as a send-off, as a means to punch the group in the rear. You're looking at a score and you see a quarter note rest all the way down. It's this huge chord voiced everywhere, but down at the bottom where the quarter note rest was, there's this huge bass drum note with 4 F's under it and an accent. The other articulation, I think, is obvious. You double the rhythm and or the melody. What did I miss? Percussion functions can serve soloistic situations, and those could be in the form of transitions, which would be very small soloistic kinds of situations musically. How many do you have? 7?
Six.
6. Okay. I missed one. Okay, mood, style. And another one I missed, which is also a very old one, is dynamic reinforcement, or adding to the tonal mass. So if you were confronted with a project, you could sit there with this list off to the side, and you could look at what you're working at and think, gee whiz, what would really be neat to do here? Maybe I need to use some color. So this can be a very valuable tool, and you won't find this in a book. So probably the most important thing I can teach you this morning is the information I just gave you. Use your ears when you're listening to your favorite music that contains percussion. See if you can figure out what function or functions the percussion scoring is serving at that particular moment. and it's pretty fascinating to study it from that perspective. Okay, let's begin with the mallet instruments. If I can stay ordered. Okay, it usually uses only the treble clef. Low notes, always a G. Well, it used to be always a G. Now it can be an F. And the high C is the highest note on the piano. Remember, it's 2 octaves higher. It's a 2.5 octave instrument. The variety of mallets that can be used. Characteristically, the instrument has a very bright sound, so you're going to use a mallet something like this, or this, or even this, wood, and hard rubber is also a possibility. It's also possible to use a medium hard or a medium rubber mallet in the lower octave of this instrument, and it sounds more mellow, and it blends very well with the vibraphone. It almost sounds like a cross between the vibraphone and a celeste. So that's another possibility.
A medium hard rubber mallet.
Or medium rubber, either one. Okay, do you all have any questions about the glockenspiel, orchestra bells? This one has a hand dampener, by the way. So I don't know if you've ever been at a concert where maybe near the end of a piece there was a run or something on here, and then all of a sudden there's a cut off and you see the player doing this. With this mechanism, you can simply cut off the entire sound with just a quick movement of your left hand.
What about vibrato?
Okay. Hand. You can also play legato. That's an old technique that dates back to the gamelan. Anything else? Chimes? I'm almost afraid to do this instrument every time I'm asked to do this. There's more confusion about this instrument. First of all, Chavez wrote a very important piece, and he wrote it in bass clef. So, the current trend in the Percussive Arts Society is to encourage composers to write for the chimes as written. The low C is here. This will probably be in conflict with your textbook. But I gave you the disclaimer.
Okay, say it again now.
The Percussive Arts Society is suggesting, as well as other really famous teachers and pedagogues that are involved with percussion, that the chimes be notated the way they should be and should have been long ago, and that is as they sound, which means the lowest note is there, unless you have an extended range. Again, lack of standardization. Your book probably lists a high F, yes, no. This one has a G. So it has 2 additional notes. You can also get some notes that fill in down at the bottom. They can go as low as this E. Basically, it's a 1 octave instrument plus a half, approximately. Depends on what you have at the top. Probably, if you study some scores, you're going to see that most of the chime notes will have been written from the middle C on up. And I guess the composers or arrangers were using the approach that it was sounding an octave higher. The confusion results from the fact that the overtones on this instrument are so unusual, and where you stand has a great bearing on how you perceive the sound, and subsequently the tessitura. So the lowest note in this small room probably going to sound lower, perhaps, than it would if you got away from it. And it does have a dampening pedal. It can be locked so that if you want sounds to all run together and build up, you can walk away from it and it's still sustained.
One of the first pieces that I ever encountered use of the chimes was La Fiesta Mexicana from H.O. and Reed. And the first time, and I was in one of the first performances of this piece, at least at the college. And when Mr. Dealer wanted to start the piece, there was one percussionist back there. It was 2 against 3. And he said, he looked at this guy standing there shaking in his boots, ready to play. And he said to him, you've got 2 notes there. Aren't you going to have somebody else play it with you? And he said, no. And then he proceeded to play this 2 against 3, which just surprised me.
Sure.
But that's how far we've come from that to this room full of stuff. And we're talking about a very short period of time, the whole history of music, saying
About 20 years.
Yeah, right, right.
Just a couple of slick tricks on this. If you're trying to create a cluster, and follow up on what he just said, and you need more than 2 notes, if it is a cluster, like a Gil Evans kind of voicing or something where you have the notes real close together, you have to visualize the instrument, so you need to be able to think what this looks like. But I can play 4 notes at once by turning the mallet sideways. And there are examples in some of the music written for this instrument where it's imperative that you do this. One of the examples uses the 2 natural half steps, so the E and the F and the B and the C. So, you could have 3-note combinations. You okay? Oh, I thought you were. So you really need to think it through. But there are some very interesting 3-note sounds. Anything else? Oh, you can also get very connected legato lines on this instrument by using the gamelan technique. The follow muffling, as we call it. You keep the pedal down, and instead of trying to connect the line by pedaling for each note, like this, you can just simply do it this way, and it sounds even better.
What precisely did you do? I mean, I saw what you
Okay.
did.
The moment I strike the G, I grab the F. The moment I strike the A, I grab the G. And so forth. So, even with some players that are supposedly pretty decent players, they can't always work the pedal efficiently. If you're playing on strange instruments, the pedal feels different. So you could notate this in your part. The traditional way that it's being notated currently would look like this for that chime part. Let's say it's half notes. Notice you put it after the pitch, so it's not mistaken for a double sharp, but it's an X placed between the notes. And when we see an X between the notes, that tells us that we're supposed to do hand dampening or mallet dampening. I'll show you on the vibraphone the same technique in a moment.
So you're dampening the F
Exactly.
just before you hit the G.
Yeah, of course, the line would be like this, and you maybe even would put legato up above it to reinforce the fact that you really want it smooth and connected. So, I mean, we can play just like you guys play on a wind instrument, on certain of these instruments. And this is new. And one of the first people that really explored the possibility of doing this is that guy right there on that poster. He came from the jazz area. He wanted the vibraphone to be more like a piano, and he plays it that way. And things do not run together when they're not supposed to. He can play lines inside contrapuntal parts, and those interior lines just leap right out at you like a second person is playing them on a different instrument. And he does it all by touching the bar. Sometimes he leans against the bar with his body to stop the sustain at the exact moment. So he brought it to another level, but historically it dates back to the gamelan with all those gongs. They play with one hand, and the other hand's going along behind, muffling the note they just played constantly.
Okay, we better move on.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Let's see, xylophone would be next. We're up at the top, kind of working our way down. Again, no standardized range, but the most common range is F, 3 octaves and a half, F to C. Sounds an octave higher than written. The low F on the most frequently encountered instrument, treble clef, 3 ledger lines. Right here. A variety of mallets are possible on the xylophone. The characteristic sound, however, is very, very harsh, bright, and brittle. Again, that note, the same as that, which is the same. It's the highest C on the piano. Okay? The low F. Now, by using a softer mallet, again in the low range, the trick I taught you about the glockenspiel, if you wanted to get a little bit of a different timbre with the marimba, this would blend just beautifully with the marimba. But this is going to stand out and stick out. Also, a wooden mallet is used. And hard rubber is also a possibility.
Is there anything that you would say absolutely not?
Brass, aluminum.
So no metal mallets on
No.
wooden bars.
Right. Now,
Your
here's
standard rule all the way.
here's what you guys need to understand. Why does the xylophone sound different than the marimba? Because the overtones are different. The overtone tuning and the overtones that are prominent in the composite sound. So check this out. Let's see if I can find it. How it's tuned. See, on this instrument, two octaves, not an octave and a fifth. Okay, so the prominent overtone on the xylophone is an octave and a fifth above the fundamental. Prominent overtone on the marimba is 2 octaves above the fundamental. The vibraphone works the same as the marimba, 2 octaves. What I'm doing is I'm dampening the fundamental with one hand to try to make the overtones speak louder so you can hear it. Okay, and chorus.
Quickly just review that of the overtones.
Okay, on the xylophone, the common strong overtone, the one that they generally, when they tune these instruments, take extra pains with, is the octave and the fifth. xylophone. By the way, you can play the xylophone with 4 mallets or 3 mallets. It's just not a 2-mallet instrument. It's possible to play 4-mallet chords on it, and they could be really wide open voicings if you needed to. I mean, they could be just huge. They could be voiced. Of course, anything real tight is also a possibility. So you could write rhythmic figures for this instrument with 4 mallets.
When did we start writing before now? I mean, before now, when we were pretty practice. When you young kids do that too.
Junior high school, it's the part's easy. Anything else? Okay, vibraphone. By the way, just for your information, these pipes are tuned to the bars. Okay, so the pipes have plugs in them. The plug for this E flat is right there. So. Okay, this instrument is probably one of the few American inventions. Although it could be disputed, some people could say, well, it's kind of like the glockenspiel. But it truly is an American invention because of the vibrato that it can achieve. And it's called a vibraharp. That's one word. A vibraphone. That's one word. Or just simply vibe. V-I-B-E. I would prefer that people know it as a vibraphone, however. Okay. Again, same, this is easy to remember, same notation as the xylophone. That's the lowest note, that F. Except it sounds where it's written, whereas the xylophone sounds an octave higher. And the vibraphone, most vibraphones are going to be 3 octaves. So, that's the highest note. It goes up. The 3 octaves above, small. Do you use that terminology in your class? Small. Is this the small
C.
tessitura? This is C1, D1, E1.
Right.
Is that how you guys do it? Okay, so how does this get vibrato, first of all? If you notice, there's a little disc inside each pipe, and the disc, when turning, will, in essence, open and close the pipe. And then there's usually a rheostat so that you can speed up the vibrato or slow it down. This one has a touch sensitive feature, so if I just touch in the middle anywhere, I stop the vibrato. And it can be programmed to stop in any position. As you can see, it's stopped in the open position. Now, there's an interesting effect that you can do with the vibraphone. It's called the bunker trill, B-U-N-K-E-R. And it's in quite a few pieces, quite a few, maybe 3 or 4. And I believe it's named after Larry Bunker, who was a source of inspiration for Gary Burton and was one of the early mallet players that had great success out in California in movie studios, doing recordings for soundtracks and doing professional recording work. Larry Bunker was is a tremendous player. He's also a drum set player. I think he came up with this. I can't illustrate it on this vibraphone because of the way this is set up. The way it works is, on any other vibraphone, you can move these discs around. So you would, for instance, close all the discs under the accidentals, and then open off, set the discs so they're vertical, so that all the natural notes are open. And then you play a sonority that has 2 notes in each manual. So maybe something like this. Then you turn the motor on, and it gets the craziest effect you've ever heard, because these get louder and these get softer. Then these get softer and these get louder, because remember, the pipes weren't the same. So the way this works is, if I close the pipe on the marimba, you're going to hear it. So, this is like an early non-electric amplifier. So that's called the bumper trill, and it's a tremendous effect, but obviously it needs to be used in a musical situation that's conducive to having that happen. But it just tends to wave back and forth. I wish I could show it to you. At any rate, obviously this has a pedal. The dampening techniques that were discussed on the glockenspiel and the chimes pertain again. So if I needed to play, for instance, something really, really simple, and it needs to be super connected, I can use mallet dampening rather than my finger. I can use my finger as well, but it's just easy to use the mallet. Pedal's still down the whole time. I haven't lifted it up once. So I can start my notes and stop my notes anytime I want. So that's the way that works. 4 mallets, 3 mallets, so you can write for 2 notes simultaneously. You can write lines, linear figures. You can write 3-note density chords. 4/4. Any questions?
Ever more than 4 mallets?
Yeah, but it's pretty limited. It could be 6, technically. Okay, I skipped the crotales and it wasn't intentional, I just forgot. Crotales, C-R-O-T-A-L-E-S. They're available in 2 octaves, and they sound 2 octaves higher than written. And the low note is middle sig. This is the lower. We have both octaves here, both chromatic octaves. This is the lower of the 2 octaves. So they're played with a metal mallet, and again, hand dampening technique would be very appropriate. You can do vibrato. By using your hand. A similar instrument but sometimes mistaken for those. These are called finger cymbals or antique cymbals. They are not available in 2 chromatic octaves. They're just, whatever they are. They're usually pitched a half step away from one another so that they are always going to be in tune with the piece that you would use them in. The beautiful thing about percussion instruments that you want to understand as students of orchestration and or arranging, composing, transcribing, instrumentation, is that many of our instruments have inharmonic overtones. Do you all know what I mean by that? Yes? No? You can't tell me.
No, go ahead, tell us.
They're not, the overtones are very numerous and they're not in tune with the fundamental. And that's why the sounds are so distinctive. That's also the reason why a pair of cymbals playing a crash in a piece tend to always sound like they're in tune. Because the analogy would be, with all the overtones in two simple plates, when you hit them together, that's like taking your arms and playing all the notes on the piano keyboard. You know, there's a fascinating thing that happens acoustically called sympathetic regeneration. And what happens is the sound of the sonority that some of these instruments play within, that sonority amplifies the harmonic overtones and stifles the inharmonic overtones. So it always sounds like you're in tune. So if I had two of these exactly the same pitch, and I played these and they were exactly the same pitch, and that wasn't a tone in the scale of the key that you're in, it's going to sound terrible. But by fogging and distorting it with this dissonance, it doesn't sound as objectionable. But a triangle is another example of an instrument that works with sympathetic regeneration. The reason the triangle always sounds so sweet is because it has all the overtones in it. I mean, it has notes that aren't even on these instruments. Okay. What did I miss?
Nothing, we're fine.
What?
We've got almost 20 minutes about.
Oh, I didn't talk about the marimba. Sorry, I mean, I did, but I didn't. I did just a basic thing. Okay, again, gee whiz. You can get a marimba that starts on this F and goes on up. You can buy a marimba that starts on this C, and it would be 4 octaves, so it would go from this C up to this C. You can purchase a marimba that has this A as its lowest sounding note. Let me show you on the chalkboard where all of these are. Until about 60, the lowest sounding note on most marimbas would be that C. And they sound as written, by the way, not an octave or anything. It's a non-transposing instrument. So what are the non-transposing instruments thus far? Quick. Right. That's the response. Come on. Answer, shout it out. Okay, so we have 2 non-transposing instruments. Up until 1960, that's about what you had to work with. From 60 until probably about 80, 81, 82, we added a third, that A. This marimba, as you can see, goes from that F. It's also possible you can get one that starts on the E. And you can also now get a low C. And it would be a 5-octave instrument then. Now, if you're going to write for a 5-octave marimba, you're probably not going to get your piece played all the time. So these are some of the, the little crucial decisions one has to make. Do I want to hear my music and make sure it can be played if you're doing composition?
How many high schools would you say in the state of Ohio have a 5-octave marimba? One?
I only know of one, but I don't know for sure that that's true.
Not very many.
I doubt that there's more than 2. 4 years ago, I only knew of definitely, there are 13 percussion schools in Ohio. If you want to study percussion, there's 13 choices. Okay? There's no state like it. It's unique. I only knew of 2 that had this low C. And one school that got it is sorry that they did now, because they have to tear it completely apart every time they move it. And it's not because they have a stupid building like this one. They have a building that was designed to have a percussion program in it, and they still can't move it. It won't fit in the elevator. I mean, it's longer than a 9-foot grand piano, and wider. So, I don't know. We're always making compromises. But this is it. It would be 5 octaves from this C. So right now, this morning, we're working with this F on this particular marimba. At Ohio University, we have just one with the low F. We have two with the low A, and we have three with the C. So, you can write some very wonderful chords and voicings for the lower register of this instrument. And there are just so many mallets that one can use to play the marimba. And by that I mean the density, the brightness, the darkness. And listen to that, low F. Just a beautiful sound. Okay, so with these really soft mallets, I'm not going to get very much sound up here if I have to play loud, but I certainly get a beautiful tone. So, I guess the thing that you might want to be aware of is when we sustain on this instrument a 3-note chord, a 4-note chord, we have a couple of possibilities. Let me put something pretty. One way is to play this chord with a roll that sustains the sound by playing it hand in hand. So I'm going to play my left hand, my right hand, my left hand, my right hand, like this. See, I'll do it in slow motion. Okay, now to make it sound pretty out front, I need to play it about this speed. Okay, I can play the same sonority by playing each note one at a time. You see what I'm doing now? Real slow, I'd be doing this. So I'm not striking double stops simultaneously. I'm playing each note one at a time. So I'm playing 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Sound in this roll. Okay. Then of course you can roll with one hand. You can have a roll with one hand here, while you got a roll with one hand here. So it's almost like a piano. The technique is really, really taken on. And that's all started since around 1970. Any questions? Just a real quick special effects category. There aren't too many special effects on this instrument. So they would amount to, if any, the type of mallet that you choose to use. On this instrument, it's possible to take a bass bow and bow the bars. Okay, so you bow out here or back here. You can use a bow on the vibraphone. You can use a bow on crotales. You can take one crotale and change the pitch by dunking it in a vat of water, like a water dome. And again, another special effect, so to speak, would be the vibrato effect, which you do with your hand on this instrument. On the crotales, you could use your hand to create vibrato on the vibraphone. But the vibraphone also has the motor that propels the little discs that open and close the pipes. On the xylophone, I guess you could bow it with a violin bow or a cello bow, maybe, probably in the low register, but I don't know how practical that is. The other special effects on these instruments are the glissandi, that's so characteristic of the xylophone. You hear it in cartoon music, and you'll hear the xylophone a lot on Saturday mornings if you watch Saturday morning cartoons. And you'll hear some players play some pretty incredibly difficult parts with 2 mallets, not 4. And just really fast, up and down and all over that xylophone. So those are pretty much the special effects for these instruments. What should I do next?
How about the timpani?
Okay.
That would take care of all pitch instruments.
Mm-hmm. By the way, maybe Mr. Socciarelli has gone over this with you. I'm sure he has, but just real quick again, in case you haven't let it sink in. It's really important how you think about the percussion orchestra. One way is to think membranophones and idiophones. Do you understand those terms?
No, they don't really understand it. I mentioned it to them the other day very quickly.
A membranophone percussion instrument is any instrument that uses a stretched skin as a sound-producing engine. So is a tambourine a membranophone? If it has a head. Trick question. There's a rock and roll rhythm tambourine that doesn't have a head that you see on MTV. That's an idiophone, that one. Okay, so anything that has one head, or some drum shells have a head on one side and a head on the other side. So those are called double-headed membranophones, like a bass drum, for instance. If you look back, well, you can't see, but behind these black tom-toms are some tom-toms that don't have a head on the bottom. They just have a head on the top, so we refer to those as single membranophones, single-headed membranophones. Idiophones are those instruments that produce sound from a naturally sonorous material. So some sort of sonorous material is the sound-producing agent. A triangle. Are these idiophones? You bet. They don't have drum heads. Got the idea? Okay, now the next thing you can think of as an instrumentation, composition, composing, arranging type student would be what materials are the instruments constructed from? So we have skin, metal, and wood. And there are many compositions that if you analyze them, you can tell that the composer was thinking skin, metal, wood, and that's what he sat down with when he put the first note on the score. Now within that classification system, skin, metal, wood, you can have tuned and untuned instruments in any of those three categories. Just like in the classification system, membranophones and idiophones, you can have tuned and untuned, or pitched and non-pitched is another terminology that works for this. You can have either in any of those two categories. Okay, so timpani. At one time, these were considered, I've got to bring my timpani now, so maybe it doesn't matter that much. At one time, these were considered a transposing instrument. Around the time of Bach, that changed because it got so confusing. But there were only two drums first. Okay, so early composers writing for this instrument were writing for two drums, not 4 or 5, 2. And they would use two, what we call the main drums, the two inner drums, or mains, M-A-I-N-S. And on the printed page, of course, the kettle drums are timpani reed bass clef only. In the bass clef, they would write a C and a G, the C being the second space up, and the G being the lower space on the staff. And then up at the top left-hand corner of the music, it might say timpani in D. So traditionally, we always played the root of the tonic and the root of the dominant. So you would look at a C, but you would have a D here. You'd look at the pitch G on the page, but you'd actually have an A tuned to this drum. Well, that got so confusing that the practice was discontinued, and I don't know quite why they did that, but I guess percussionists couldn't read that. I don't know. So they're no longer a transposing instrument. And this is another one where the information that I believe in and give you might be in slight disagreement with your book, and I'm not sure which book you're using. But we have 4 drums, and the largest one, that largest timpano, starts from this note. That's the lowest note it's capable of playing. So what do you guys call this? Small grade C. This C right here. And in all honesty, I still like to believe that the range of each drum that's really usable and practical is really only a fifth. So this is maybe where I might be in disagreement with your textbook. This drum is tuned to the lowest note F, so right above that C. This drum is usually tuned to an A or a B flat above that F. The difference is if you're in orchestra, you tune it to an A usually because the room is filled with A's. If you're in some sort of a band ensemble, the room is filled at the beginning of the rehearsal with B flats, so you tune it to a B flat. And then this drum is usually tuned to a C or a D. It depends on how high you need to play on it, so it varies. So we have C, F, let's say A, and C. Most people don't do that, though. I think I played for I don't know how many years before I ever had to play a low C. And when the first time I ever had to play a low C was here, and it was a piece of contemporary music that was very, very odd and different. And that's the only time I ever needed a C. So usually we tune this drum to like a D. Would be right above that C. That gives us a little more range at the top then. So you'd still have a fifth. Your range is basically determined by what the bottom note is. So if the bottom note's a C, you're going to get a great G. If the bottom note's a D, you're going to get a pretty darn good A. But if the bottom note's an F on this drum, you're certainly not going to get a decent C if you get a C at all. So it's a little bit of a sliding kind of scale that you have to think about. Most people keep this as an F, so the highest note that's really, really a great sounding note on this drum would be a C. Now I can go that far. Some drums will go even further than that, but the sound gets very choked and pinched. Most people tune this to a B flat, and most people tune this to a D. So you can have a little chart next to you if you're fumbling around trying to figure out, gee, can I find these notes and score them into the kettle drum part? That little chart might say D, F, B flat or A, and a D. And then you can refer to that chart and think it through. What you have to remember is it takes a little bit of time to change pitch. But people still have written parts where you're changing the pitch on one drum while you're playing on two other ones or three other ones. Or you're playing on four drums, some kind of a figure, and you're changing the pitch on two of them while you're playing. So you have to be able to have like a foot memory kind of thing so that your foot feels the interval. You know that when you need to move a half step, your foot moves a certain distance. When you need to move a whole step, your foot moves a certain distance. So basically, within reason, you can almost write anything you want. There are examples of pieces where the kettle drums will play a chord. I didn't bring four mallets over with me, but you can hear all three at the same time. You can strike three. You can hold two timpani mallets in one hand, is what I'm trying to say. And you can strike all four drums at once, or any three, any combination of three. Another common effect on this is the glissando. Up or down.
What about gauges?
They're handy because, people are exploring the boundaries so much, composers and arrangers, they don't have to have gauges. They have to be set, of course, before the performance or rehearsal, which they certainly should know. It's a nice feeling to be playing with two drums. With one foot, you have to reach over to a drum, and you don't even have a chance to ever check it. You have to change the pitch on it, and a moment later, you have to play on that. It's a crucial exposed part, and that's pretty scary. So having the gauge certainly helps because you can get closer to the note sooner. It's not right on. It depends on how you care for the gauges. So I guess you often think, there's a gauge on the drum.
questions, or if we can take 60 seconds, anything you want to ask us? Okay, thank you. Look, the purpose of the class is for the students to familiarize themselves up close with the cellist and his instrument, and to learn some things about it, and to reaffirm those things that they read in the textbook that are just words.
This is supposed to be
So that they can
conduct an orchestra?
No, so that they can write and compose eventually. So that things that they can familiarize themselves with, listening to you play on each individual string, so they get the idea of what the sound of these individual strings are in comparison, say, to what the sounds are of other strings.
I suppose the first thing we talk about is the sound of some of the book scopes. We have a variety of staccato, staccato, modulate,
Yes.
things like that. And my understanding of the meaning of the Italian roots of these things is that they pretty much all mean cut. And it's a matter of tradition as to what they really sound like these days. We like to think we know what they sound like when they're really
You probably don't.
So, yeah, and as a result, there are probably, no matter what I tell you today, you're going to find a variety of opinions about what these words mean by the sound. Obviously, in my opinion. Staccato is the simplest one. As long as there is, it doesn't sound. We would call that legato, although it is a détaché with legato. I'm trying to make it as smooth as I can, and I suppose if you were a composer or leading an orchestra, what you associate that with is speaking with another tune, where the articulation is made with a D or a B sound, so you're repeating the tone while you sort of use the consonant as articulate. Instead of ta, 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 you say da, 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 number of tone beats. So you get slight sound. So, you slur them obviously. Like the equivalent of not using the dental sound. So there one is la, la, la. Staccato, you simply separate a little more than that. And how much? Another thing. Where the reverberant fall, I suppose you will wisely choose to put more silence in it, because it won't sound like that on the very dry hall. Connecting the phone. Over the years, rarely do you see the word staccato actually printed in the music. The music is just used about like any other instrument. And as far as I can tell, according to what the word descriptions of this, the dots only meant to do not slur. And then as the concert halls slowly became more and more slurred and larger, people decided to really put some plans between. Probably because the exaggeration became more striking and more fashionable, like anything you do. Now, staccato usually means with a horse that actually leaves the string in between the pitches. Something like that. It's usually reserved for slightly faster notes. Pure staccato, which is just you use the horse And again, there's a million ways of playing each one of those. It depends on the character you're trying to get. If you go down to number 4, saltando, sometimes called Socciarelli. There, the horse there, if it leaves the spring, it leaves it so shallow that maybe it's not even the spring, maybe it's only the stick of the mouth.
Mark, would that be a measured same thing as a measured tremolo?
At that speed, it could be measured tremolo, it could be just sometimes you start to extend it down on the second or last line of tremolo like that. You see 3 slashes is the symbol for tremolo. If the tempo is slow enough, sometimes it confuses the performer. You don't know whether it's supposed to measure it at 30 seconds or whether it's just how fast as we can go. How is that? Good question. So, if you're writing music, you want to keep that in mind if you can keep your focus like that. Sometimes it's wise simply to put the word measure underneath the line or something this way.
Was the saltando rhythm the same thing as Socciarelli?
I think so. And some of these words are just didn't incorporate them into the English. Let's see, with Margolay, this is the sound of a Suzuki player. Basically, I think they usually teach you kind of squeeze the stick into the string here at the beginning, and then you release it with an explosion this way, and then you regrip. I don't like this most, but I don't teach it much. It gives the students bad habits of the second thundering there. Apparently the whole school now these days founded on this. And so there's a more beautiful way to produce the martelette. Probably all like the time to explain that. And what I do is I simply don't clamp down on it both at the end of the note. Okay? So for me, I bring it to a stop and there's none of that stuff. So again, these are matters of taste, but it tends to be a much more forceful stroke itself. And as far as I'm concerned, to the listener, the difference between all of these things is how the both strokes sound at the beginning of it and how it sounds at the end. So staccato. This would be a gentle martelette. Staccato. Something like that. So what you're getting is different between the beginning and end of the sound. Slight difference in the color of the tone.
The ugly sound with the martelette was because you kept the pressure at the end of the bellow?
That's what I was thinking.
Okay, and the way that you softened it was by simply releasing the pressure, or?
Well, what they do is usually release the pressure immediately at the beginning of the bow stroke, so but then you clamp down here at the end, and it's usually just done inactive.
Call your second example a sustain on the line?
Well, I suppose that depends on how long the note is. It's hard to do martelette on a whole note, for instance. Because it's also fast, very fast bow speed, this one affects the color of the tone. And it's a fairly difficult bow stroke to get the sound nice, because if you race the bow across the string too fast, it becomes not very effective. However, not everything in life is supposed to be pretty. You're not always need to express yourself. You can have a real strength or a real beauty to it without being pretty looking. So, depends on what you're trying to offer. Okay. Solo voce, mezzo voce. player should, it's hard to make a difference between those two. What it means is just make a less substantial sound than you would if you're trying to project through back in the hall. So, instead of really even pushing it like that, you do something like that. It's not so much that it's lower decibels, or whatever you associate with the piano, but it is a different color, and it's it needs partial, one way or another partial voice, not a full voice.
Did you call the second one profondo?
Yeah, there's the other configuration too. Profondo's on here somewhere. Yeah. Profondo literally means, I guess, like flute, fluting, and so whatever you think flute sounds like, that's what I imitate that.
Well, that seems to be like Soltasto, huh? You're almost up above.
Right, and literally, tasso means touch, because, and that's, in Italian, that's what the frets were called, with the fingers of the left hand touch. So if you play over where those frets are, you call it tasso. So you can get tasso probably most easily by playing and the reason you get a peculiar sound there is because the string tends to vibrate fattest in the middle of the string and stingeth down here. And so as you play closer and closer to that fat part, you're interfering with more and more of the vibration. So down here, you get a clearer sound, less interference. Here, doesn't really sing very well. Now, we don't play up that high usually. There's different things. And of course, these differences are subtle, but that's all fine art.
If you go back to mezzo voce and piano, I mean, is there some technical difference in creating, you said there was a difference in sound, but is there something?
If I play an ordinary, good, healthy voice, I play loud, with the same voice, very soft, but that's different from Soltasso or Profondo, which I would play with a faster bow. Soltasso literally only means over finger bow.
But mezzo voce would be in the same spot of going.
It would be easier for me to do a half voice and by getting away from the bridge.
So it's probably the same thing as.
In a way, they kind of all mean the same thing, but not quite, you know.
So the basic point is to remember whether we're playing Soltasso or not. If we want to play mezzo voce or sotto voce, we'll play Soltasso. If we want to play piano.
Generally, yeah. Okay. But I suppose, again, it's a matter of, I could call that mezzo voce, but maybe that's not, maybe it's just soft. So you can see why there's a little confusion for the performer when they sing certain things. And also, it depends on the skill of the performer. Some people cannot play soft close to a bridge. And as soon as they see the word down, the single foot down, they immediately lift off on the bridge. And so they get a different color as well as a different pattern.
What they look, some of what's there is just lightening up of the pressure on the bow, and Profondo is lightening up and also
Probably
faster.
and that would make a distinction, clear distinction from what I'm doing. But it's hard to argue against anybody saying different things.
Mark, because we don't have very much time, could we move on to some of the other things like harmonics, and you demonstrate some harmonics for us, natural and
The harmonics are different. Harmonics are all produced by lightly touching a string at one of its easy dividing points. Essentially, the string will naturally divide into half, thirds, quarters, and multiple of those.
same pitch, if he touches the string 1/3 of the distance from the bridge and 1/3 of the distance from the nut, these both will produce that same harmonic.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and you can see on the, perhaps the C string, there's a note here. This thing. It's not straight. If you put it here, there are 3 bellies to the vibration. I can touch the string also with this other note. We get the divide into quarters. Also divide it to half point, quarter point, also the quarter point down.
Mark, when you divide into quarter point and you touch it up here, and then you touch it, do you have a preference as to where you're going to touch the string? Is that determined by the sound that you want, or is it just because of facility to make it easier to do?
We start learning the instrument down here and finish our way up here year by year. So without first, we don't even know how to do that. Because, you know, if you want to know to play this high, you write for a violin. Right. Unless you want, you know, if the music is about discomfort and stress, you know, you want the sound. Now, what we call also artificial harmonics, all you do is you simply use as your original string length something different from just this open string. So you can, this is now your new string length, and you divide that into halves, thirds, or quarters. And of course, what we have to do is we press the string all the way down here, so we define that string length, and then we find somewhere around here where it's either, for us cellists, either we divide the string into quarters or thirds. Theirs is divided into thirds, and is divided into quarters. And for each cellist like it's divided into fourths, it's better because it's down here it's really hard to do.
Mark, you use the thumb, you and the contrabass player use your thumb for artificial harmonics, right?
Or
Do you do that with the thumb up in this position here, or do you only start to use the thumb when you get down in this, farther down?
it depends. There are a lot of players these days whose hands are just small enough so no matter what they do down here for the distance of what would be a fourth, they just can't do it. So they'll be done from here. So I don't know.
Okay. All right.
But certainly, and usually, even though it's smaller distance up here,
When does the thumb come into play when you're playing stop notes on the fingerboard? In upper, higher positions, when you get beyond the...
generally, beyond about this, what we call fourth position, where the thumb is in the neck, the hand starts to get, as it goes this way, the line of the fingertips wants to come up to this way. Therefore, the fourth finger has a hard time reaching. So wherever that is for a particular belt, that's where you stop on the unit and use the thumb. But for most of it, it's around. It also depends on the particular musical gesture. There are some passages even down here where you use a thumb.
Socciarelli wanted to ask you about glissando and portamento.
Oh, yes. What's the difference between glissando and portamento? Has it blurred over the many, many years, or is there still a real distinction between the two of them?
As far as I can tell, portamento is it's kind of funny because glissando, the root of the word gliss does not come from Italian, but glissando is from the Italian form of a word. Gliss comes from the French word. Portamento, so usually glissando, and the distinction we have to make between portamento and portato. The one that usually used. might, I try to be aware for musicians, there's a trill, which is to the beginning of the bottom line, notated as it is for any instrument. On the previous line, the last thing, sometimes composers will want, instead of a second, they'll want a third or something like that. And that's usually how they notate. So the two quarter notes with those three slices between, usually the direction would be a half note. If there's a problem with this, obviously if you have too large an interval, you can't do it on one from one to so you end up having to do this to the bow, and it's an entirely different sound. So you have to be careful with some vocals. If you want this, sometimes you just can't get it out of it. So what you, the intervals you might write that for a violin, and they can throw a lot more musical intervals on that.
What would you suggest the largest interval? So that people with smaller hands than some other people can get the part played.
With the thumb, I suppose, a lot of people would have trouble with it, even with the thumb. So 4 would be probably okay. And again, you have to be careful what you juxtaposition that with, because if you're in one physical orientation of the song, you have this pitch, and you have to be careful from the
How about multiple stops, double stops and triple stops?
you just, you play too much on. For double stops, that's a simple one. Triple stops, there's always going to be variety in execution of what you write. If you write third line from the bottom, the last thing I've got, this demonstrated physicality is a plus. Some people will like it by strumming. Some people will all three at once. The same thing with bowing it. Some people, most people would roll the chord. But if you write maybe just a succession of quarter notes, then you would have to do it. Most of us try to play them all at once, which means bearing down on the middle string so that you can catch all three strings. And if you're not careful, you can get a nasty sound trying to do it. These are the things you be careful of who you're writing it for. If you're writing it for an ideal performance course, and if you're writing it for a high school, it might make fuzzy sounds in the time.
Are cellists ever asked to use scordatura?
The guys on the two boxes in the same down have to box and pitch sweep the A string coming under the E. That's pretty standard stuff. It's not good, we're 20 something. Although we don't do it as much as
What about collegno?
That's kind of that's a confusing also. As far as I can understand, from what I read of the history of this, we really first, I suppose this one of the Italian overtures had some kind of thing. Those around, no, they would didn't stand. But it was around the turn of this century, 1900, around there, they wanted, the composers were wanting to incredibly extreme ranges of things, especially dynamics, and they didn't trust the performer when they scored triple tone or even quadruple tone to really get what they wanted. So, Colin really started there with simply kicking the bow whichever way you play better, so much that there's maybe one hair on the string. And the idea was to get almost
Was the wood actually touching the string at that time?
I suppose it could, because it's not going to have enough
best bowing that we know today in the 20th century are composers who really turn the bow over, and
Right.
that's what we think of. But
Yeah.
historically,
So they didn't necessarily want to hear the sound of wood. They was, although they thought that was a softer sound than you get, but that was the idea, to get it not per se, not so much like that.
okay.
And after a while, they started hearing it, and calling it, that became more of a stage. Now, there is, you have to be careful how you do this, because for longer notes, obviously you have to do it quite like that, but if you see quarter notes, sometimes you don't know whether the composer wants to, or, and that became a lot of it. Usually, if the composer wants that, they'll write colonial batuto, which means the beat. But sometimes they leave out that word and then there's some confusion. So if you want one or the other, you can be clear about it.
Any questions from anyone in the class?
Cool.
Clay bowing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Tell me what you understand collation means.
We have it down on our sheet, you know, Socciarelli about Collet. I'm just wondering what your opinion is.
That was one of the bowings that I had given them to look up in the Columbia.
Yeah, what, that's not something, that doesn't give us a bow stroke, that's a training technique for the hand. So you won't find that in music too much, you'll find it in picture books. What we need to do on the string machines is have these joints be very loose while we're playing. And in order, generally when a beginner first picks this stuff up, they grab so tight that this stuff starts to rock. And so, what we do is, we go, we figure if they can move from here, then eventually it will stay loose while I just this stuff. So it's a training technique.
So it wouldn't be a bowing like a legato bowing. Or
The violinists generally train this with a very fast motion because their strings going to vibrate faster and you can stand that speed. On the cello, I train it a slower motion, so we don't get used to accepting it not to happen.
anything else? Any other things you like? Yes.
Flautando imply no vibrato, or is that?
No. And with something modo ordinary, that's what we use to cancel a lot of these things. And then you're stuck with whatever the performer thinks is the ordinary way to play.
What about portamento and glissando? I mean, there's no, when I think glissando, I don't think vibrato, but when I think portamento, I think there's still.
So, if you slide up, that kind of a...
Well, I'm thinking of musical phrases that are like portamento, where the string player still keeps vibrato in the tone as they're moving from note to note, as opposed to.
What do you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
As opposed to a straight bliss where it just seems to be a straight tone.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, actually, this relates to another confusion. If you see a half note, and then this symbol for another half note, sometimes we don't know whether we're supposed to basically play mostly a half note, and do the song, or whether we're still supposed to start the song immediately at the beginning of the song. We don't know. So very often we have to ask the composer if he's sitting on the rehearsal, what do you want? And they have to. So I would suggest, Jennifer?
Oh, interesting. I think that my understanding of portando is there's an articulation in half steps of the note, and each, when it's written in the music, it's written as half steps with the same finger over.
Yeah. It's to imitate the singer's kind of register on the bass line, which they put in even if you don't play it. vibrato going on inside. It doesn't have the same effect on the string instrument as it does in singers. Singers just sound like they're going from one note to another, and that's the way they do it.
Is that why you were asking that question the way you asked it, because of your vocal training?
No, I was actually thinking of the string part for the doctorate, the cello, maybe the cello in the first batch. Ba da 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 da. That's pretty real thin. It might be, but it's just the way it yeah, but then I heard a 49 there was a lot of awful today.
Okay. Now, there's again where we don't know whether they meant for example or for I think if we would stick to what he's saying, we'd be better off. Do that, what we call that portamento. And call. So, as what Jeff said, usually what she's saying, portamento would be like third written in part, like a half step each interval a little bit higher. That'd be portamento.
More like an articulation.
Yeah.
It's like stopping the rhythm.
Yeah, it's kind of like a vibrato going up.
Yeah.
Right, and that would be like as if you written out in half step, or you just write the word vibrato and hope to perform it. So that would be a portamento, would be vibrato over there.
Instead of articulating your first hand, you're articulating your second.
Yeah, there's the other thing. Sometimes we can just slide it here. Or that's one, or we can do this. So we got a push there. So there's even more confusion. So I think the difference between portamento and the tondo is the portamento is vibrating upwards. Yeah. Here. What mute? Well, mute? I'm sorry, I misplaced my mute. All I have is practice mute today.
Oh,
So that can, they don't work so well on the cello. Because we don't practice it. A lot of people think of mute is to make us lower decibels. It's really meant to change the color. And so some of us who refuse to use mutes in an orchestra, we just simply play a different color. Because we can get it without music. And very often you can enter the instrument trying to put mute on and off and on.
Which are the different ones playing? What's the difference between which ones are playing and which ones
see, that for the violinist, there are two kinds of mutes. The one that looks like the one you just, your practice mute, you know, the one little black wooden one, and that's just the regular mute. And then the one that is the clamp, that's clamped on that they slide up.
It slides up and there's a lip over one side of it that clamps down onto the top of the stick.
And that's why it's called a clamp.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
It's everybody wants to make a fuss
Thanks,
or
Mark.
design something they think is better.
Thanks, Mark.
Gonna follow your book a little bit on it and the basement. It starts on page 61. I don't know if you want to follow along. Because there are some excerpts, and if you want to make some notes about what I play or what I do. But as far as how many different names there are for the bass, you can call it anything you want, we'll answer. The contrabass or double bass is probably the most common. It's a little bit about the fact that it's not really in the violin family, it's a viol because it's tuned in fourths instead of fifths, and that's largely just because of logistics about to make a fourth, to make the fingering so that you can play anything without killing yourself. It force lends itself more readily. Because if starting, if you're gonna be a band director or having strings or even want a bass player and you're starting a kid, the positions that you take any of your string methods dictate what notes you can play at what level, and you have to raise in bass is called half position, where you start right here, right next to the nut where the strings are, and you can play a scale. Or without going anywhere. And that's important, especially if you're an early bass player, because the hand position, the string is so long, all you get is a major second between your first and your fourth finger. If you're playing a violin whose fingerboard completely is about this long, I mean, you're squishing your fingers next to each other. I don't think Mr. Conklin could play violin. He's got the biggest bare hand. And for cello, it's okay, but I mean, they don't fit next to each other work well. But logistically, string size and string length is real important because your string length is dictated by nut and bridge, and basses will vary a great deal. There will be some mammoth instruments, but they're very difficult to play, and if you have small hands like I do, you just can't get it out. So that's why it's string resource. It really doesn't have anything to do with one being better than the other. Being 16, I played on the sits or on a tall stool in bands. I sit on a short stool that's preference because I like to be more comfortable. Everybody sat on a tall stool because that's all there was. You go down to the Boulder Square, you fly the standard 3 and bar stool, and that's why they sat on it. It's not major second. Oh, transposing instrument just in that it sounds an octave lower. So don't think that basses are transposers. I mean, we're not transposers like trumpet. It's just an octave lower. And a lot of times you'll see a lot of music, even up to Mozart, that the bass and cello partners will written on the same sheet. They'll say cello and bass, and we just play the same sheet. Strings E, A, B, G, and chords, and then if you look at the range for elementary school and high school stuff, I don't know how many elementary basses you work on. Most people start basses or people on cello if they want to play bass flex instrument because there are very few basses around that are playable by a kid who's 5th, 6th grade, depending on when your string program starts. And they usually start them out on a cello because they can also carry it, because most 5th graders are not this small. So an elementary range is not really that important, but you get into high school, it's mostly physical limitations. The body of the instrument, where the neck stops, you have to get over the instrument, is where most high schoolers stop. It's a real mental and physical break. So you get up on the G string, you get up to a D, and corresponding on every string. Although it is the case where when you start a scale or you start anything, you start on a low note, you're going to switch to the next string and not move up the fingerboard. So when they list that the high school range on the E string goes up to a B, and that's up here, you'll find very few who do that. So, I mean, you have to be careful when you score for younger players, what you do because of their limitations. But once you get to high school, you can expect a little more, and then professional, you can do most of what you want, and they'll just grumble at it. But let's see, on professional, you have your harmonic, which I'll talk about more later, but that's the next real grade. But that you can reach comfortably without having to do any real hygiene. And at the bottom of that page, they talk about string sound, how each string sounds, and I don't know if I agree totally, but they say dark and somber for the E string, and that's the E string. They're calling dark and somber. The tone is dull and foreboding. Okay. A string has more buzz, but it's ponderous, which I take issue with, but this is a trifle bland. Some of the biggest passages in the bass literature are on the A string, and that's actually where it's fast string, if you can get around that. Because what happens when you play a bass, because the string is so long, it takes the string a lot longer to vibrate. So it's harder to play fast passages on a big fat string. Pardon? Yeah, it gets worse as the string gets long. Right. Which we get to. D string, what do they say? Mellow, reedy a bit. Which is probably true. And your G string is mostly where your solo is. Going on. Okay, it's talking about the low extension, which I have. Not everybody does. And again, in high school, there's very few. My time in college, what they have is an extension that makes the E into a low C, which gives you just another bit of range. Several theories on why there is a low C. Some think that some bases have too much time on their hands to do it. There's another theory that Mozart and lots of people, when they were writing parts for cello and bass, because they would write for the cello, because the cello's bottom string is a low C. So some people thought that they just threw the bass line in there as well, and some bass players wanted to play it, so they were industrious enough that they could make it. Now, they talk about a machine, which I used to have, and it has little fingers that come up just like this. Actually, I stowed it away. Oh yeah. Yeah, they're very expensive because they're contraptions. And picture 4 fingers here, and then there's a finger for each note. There's this big rod that comes along here, and I took it off mostly because the thing rattled like, it sounded like a suit of armor when you really get this C string going. If you can feel the instrument, it really vibrates. And if you're on a wood floor, you don't feel it in the chairs. It really makes a good bit of vibration and slide. It was kind of annoying because I used to have to hold on to it. So you have fingers here, and then you pull these fingers down as it's like buttons, like on an auto harp. And that's how you play each note down here. Well, you have a limitation of how fast you can go, how quickly the notes will speak, how fast the machine moves. But that was one way that they got so that you didn't have to put your hands up here. This is called a fingered extension because you use your fingers. But it is a nice way to get a nice effect because you really can get some nice pedals. They talk about pedal points in the book that every composer uses since the beginning of time, and basically will hum along on a note forever, and things go on top of it, and it's very exciting. They talk about 5 strings, which in this country you will very rarely see. I wouldn't even worry about it. They're more common in Europe, and you can some add a high string, a high B if you want to play mostly solo stuff, but a lot of times it's a low B to do just the same thing, play low notes, and be a little more effective on fingering.
David, before we get off that low C, does the bass, is scored to a part of the repertoire of the contrabass?
It is to the extent that if you don't have a low C extension, you can retune the E string to a lower note. And that, if you're doing any scoring, don't go any lower than a D, because once you go lower than a D, this thing starts to get real floppy once you lower it, and it doesn't make any sound. It sounds like a banjo, or not a banjo string, it sounds like a rubber band. But before I had an extension, it was quite common that if you're playing Handel's Messiah, which has a ton of stuff in E flat, that you need these low E flats, and you don't have it. So what you do is you tune it to a D, which makes it identical to your upper D string, so that mentally you can also handle, no pun, I'm sorry, also understand mentally where you are, because if you tune this to a C sharp, you have no frame of reference of what the next note is, because then your fourths are thrown out the window. So what you have here are octaves, a D to a D for your open string if you retune. So that's commonly done. But that's one of those things where a performer has to feel it's worth it. If you've got one E flat in a tune, you're not going to do it.
David, did composers ever change any of the other strings in the repertoire?
No. Never played anything except the usage of scordatura for solo repertoire playing, in which you actually are supposed to change the strings. There are solo strings, these are orchestral strings. Solo strings would be tuned a whole step up. So just take all the strings and crank them up a whole step, and what it does is brightens the sound so that it cuts through in front of the orchestra. That's more commonly used for concertos and things like that. But otherwise, we don't do much finger cranking because,
You all understand that term, scordatura.
Scordatura is just retuning a string. Violinists, upper strings will do it a lot more often. I don't know if any of you ever played guitar or heard any guitars, but there are different ways to tune a guitar to have an open tuning or something like that. You could call that scordatura, they don't necessarily, but it's the same kind of thing. It's just changing it from what you're traditionally used to have. But the extension is a nice thing. It's not that big a deal, but if you know who you're scoring for, or if you're composing and you're doing it for if you can make it optional. If you write it in, don't worry about it, because if the people don't have it, they'll just play it up an octave. It's not a big problem, but if you really want something like that, you need to make sure that whoever's going to perform it has the equipment. You wouldn't write something for a concert bassoon if there was not a concert bassoon within 300 miles. So that's the only thing you have to be aware of. As far as clefs go, you mostly bass clef, but once you get above a certain point with 17 ledger lines, they'll switch to tenor clef, which is one of the movable clefs, which I remember as a freshman in college, we were playing Shostakovich 5, and there's a passage that screams up onto the fingerboard, and I was like a guy driving down the road that I just saw a stop sign that I'd never seen before, and I did one of those, and I had never seen a tenor clef in my life. A tenor clef just shifts so that they can write it a little easier. Most of your solo repertoire is written in tenor clef because of where it lies on the instrument. Just like trombone. Trombone's the same way. It's the same, a lot of the same range. So you'll see tenor. You will see treble clef when you get up into harmonics or really high notes, but it's just another thing that you can do to get away from ledger lines. But that's the one that we use. Violas use alto clef, which then I have to start counting on. Oh, but if you ever need to learn another clef, don't transpose. Learn the clef. Transposing takes too much time. You'll never be able to do it.
That is conductors.
Learn your clef.
Learn your clef.
Counting takes forever, and people, if you're up in front of a group, they know you're counting, especially if they're listening, which mine tend to do. Let's see. Okay, I'll get into harmonics. Playing a note, you have horsehair on the, if you have, I don't want to bore you, but the horsehair on the bow is coarse. You put rosin on it to make it grab even more, and what you're doing is making the string vibrate very many times as you're dragging the bow across the string. And you can, as you watch the string, in the center is where it vibrates the most, and it gets in a tapered fashion towards the bridge. So if you need a bow where you can essentially keep up with it, there's a certain rate of speed that you need to follow, because you need to follow the width you have, so you can control, increase your sound just by where you place the bow. Because string playing, there's the three things: contact point, which is where you're on the string, bow speed, and bow pressure. And just think of turning a doorknob. That's how I apply pressure onto the bow. When I hold it like this, it's just turning a doorknob. And you put pressure on the bow, which you can see the bow move up and down in there.
Speaking of bows, David, before you go on, in contrabass playing, there are two bows that one can use. You are using your French bow.
Right.
Do you prefer that? Do most bassists prefer that?
No. I don't know if it's flipped down the middle, but it's just personal preference. There are some things that are better. French bow looks like all your other string family bows, the violin bows. It's held the same way. A German bow, this is the black part's called the frog, has a bigger opening here, and you hold it. You would hold it like this, and if the age-old tradition of standing, you have your arm is very free. You get a very nice, big, free sound. This was, obviously the Germans came up with it. They thought that it had nicer sound, and like this, it was not as natural a hand position as this was, and that's what they came out with. There are limitations for both bows. It's not really an issue. It's just that you might know that they exist. Lots of you had. If you think of the German tradition of music throughout history, the German bow lends itself to that. So that's another type of bow. But back to bows, the bow is comparatively short compared to instrument length. If you look at a violin, the bow is usually longer than the instrument, and therefore they can play much longer passages on one bow, whereas a bass player, you don't get very far before you have to turn around. When they talk about a pedal, they talk about the pedal point in the book, where if you've got more than a couple people, you can stagger your bowings, which works. It's not really an issue too much, except that don't expect bass players to do bowings the way the rest of the group does. They're going to break it up. I mean, some of the excerpts I'll play, you'll see that there's a long slur over the whole passage, and I'll take 2 or 3 bows simply because I have to. But you just turn around and do whatever you can. Okay, harmonics. You've got natural notes that you push the string down fully, and then harmonic is just creating a false stop. You just touch the string at certain points in the intervals. Half of the string, if you cut the string in half, you get an octave. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, then if you can cut that into a fourth and a fifth, and then there's one more, which you can get a third. But your intonation might not always be so hot. So what you'll have is, I think they mentioned bending, which is actually not written much. Maybe some late 20th century music, but I haven't come across much stuff where you actually bend the string deliberately. Most of the time what you have is picking a harmonic, and you hear in your intonation throughout the groove, you kind of bend it so that you're in tune, because it's unlike stopping the string, where you adjust it simply because there are no frets. The harmonic, you are stuck to one place because it only vibrates. Once you get off it, it stops. It stops to really. There is a point where it likes to resonate. So, that comes into a little bit of. I guess they've got double stops on the next page.
So those are natural harmonics.
Natural harmonics.
And the other one are artificial harmonics. Can you address that? Yeah,
artificial harmonics are possible in a very short window of possibilities, simply because the string is so long. On a shorter string instrument, you can reach half of the string length within your hand. Obviously, you cannot, because an artificial harmonic deals with creating your own stop, your own nut, in a sense, and then placing a harmonic. And then you can move it. And many solo pieces in the violin repertoire especially have whole passages where you play melodic passages in artificial harmonics, and you're actually expected to play in tune. Basses don't do that very much. Most of the time it's used for effect, and things like this. Because you can hear it break. It's almost like a trombone slide when you come up, and then you hit a break. The same thing. It'll jump back and down to another octave. And it can be used for effects and can be effective, but it's not a melodic tool to be used. Let's see. We'll go to pizzicato, which is just plucking the string, and not too much to it. A lot of jazz played mostly pizzicato. Anybody see Mr. Holland's Opus? Okay, the tune at the end that they did, the big piece that he wrote, is a good example. I don't know, if you see the score, if you ever see the score, it was kind of some tough high school writing. It was a high school, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, because there's the little rock section they have through there in 6/8, and it flies along, and there's lots of strips. Unless you've got some kids who play electric bass and practice, fast pizzicato is tough, especially if you don't have, I mean, a lot of people won't have this is called a quiver, bow and arrow quiver, same. They won't have a quiver, and then you're stuck with a bow in your hand and then having to play. And most of the time you use one finger. So if you're writing quick passages, they will, you stick fortissimo next to it, and it's never going to happen. So you have to be careful about how quickly you pick things. If, for example, if you're playing something, if you've got something in 6/8, you want triplets, you got to break it up, or some sort of variation, because it's just not physically possible for how big the string is, for how long it takes to speak, and all the other limitations of having a bow in your hand and having to play. I mean, I can't do two-fingered with a bow in my hand. And German bow, they hold it like this, and then when they play pitch, they drop it down this way, but it's the same thing. You're stuck with one finger, and it gets very hard to do. But most of the time it's not a problem, but it can be, and I thought that was interesting that that was written for high school. It's an absolute exercise. Double stops. A lot of double stops can be played. Most of the time they are, people will choose to do divisi, because if you're in an orchestral setting, you'll do inside, outside, or every other person will take a note, because lots of harmonics, or lots of double stops. As they said, when you said it sounds muddy, if you play a double stop, just a nice fifth, I mean, you can hear it, and it makes sense, but it fights with itself. So it's much more sonorous if you have one person playing the E, one person playing the B. It mixes by the time it gets to you, and it sounds a lot nicer. The higher you get on the instrument, the better it sounds. It fights with itself less. Octaves, you can always do octaves. Most of the time is when people want more sound out of the instrument. That's not a problem. In 20th century writing, I played a piece that you play tritones, but again, it's for effect, because you want that fighting sound. So double stops are possible, but again, you have to stay in the realm of how far a person can reach. Fifths are about, you can't write a sixth, I can't reach a sixth. So don't get too ambitious, but if you want to know, go ask the bass player to play. If you hate it, write divisi or split it up between the cellos. But triple stops are not really, I played the triple stop in a solo, but it's broken up because of the curve of the strings. The way the bridge is, the bow can't touch three strings at once, but there was at the end of a tune. Then you got your cadence. You play two at once and then two at once, but in a sense it's a triple stop. But it's not usually. I mean, you're just adding to this problem. You're playing two strings at once, you play three strings at once, it's not good. Composition. When you get into solo playing, or if you get, like when Shostakovich 5 when I was playing in the right and center clef, what you do is you take your nut, which is the opening, or if you're on the G string, which is mostly where you go. How many? you take your G, which is your harmonic, which is your next big physical landmark, and then you stick your thumb as if it's the nut. That's where you have to turn thumb. And then you can play from here. But mostly, one is harder. I mean, it's a more accomplished player. Two, it sounds brighter, it's louder, and it cuts better over an orchestra, which is mostly what it's played. And then you go from there. And you can actually, it actually has a nice sound. So it's, but up there you can do a little more double stops. But again, you've got, you're in the professional range of playing, unless you've got a high school music council. You're going to have trouble getting it played like that. You have Bach cello suite. You know, that kind of stuff where you're playing up here as if you're playing in half the first position. But it's all up here and it's a lot more cello-like, which is what all bass players are. They start a cello especially when they have to carry the thing.
How about muting, David?
Okay, muting, you've got, this is the standard, pardon? Yeah, well, there are bigger ones. There are ones called practice mutes. We've never seen a violinist mute it. A little wooden thing that has three fingers. Take off the standable onto the bridge. Well, we have one too, except it's about the size of a small rodent. And you stick it onto the string, you stick it onto the bridge, which mutes the resonance of the instrument, so you get a much darker sound, and it pushes. And also you can combine muting with no vibrato, because anytime you play a string instrument, you're always going to have a vibrato, which gives you a warmer sound. If you can combine muting with no vibrato, you can still get a nice sound, but you get more of an effect. Another effect is Socciarelli. You have that? Okay. On a bass, you can do it. I mean, you can really get nasty. The further down you get, everything is in degrees, and you can either play low. Largely, what you have is tremolo used on a Socciarelli. Consultato is playing over the fingerboard, which on the bass is not used as much, simply because the fingerboard varies in length so much that you may not get the same effect as you don't get the same effect as you do on a violin. Again, it has to do with bow length, string length, and how much it takes to vibrate. But generally, on a bass, you're just struggling so hard to get a sound to come out of the thing that you don't worry about bringing it up by changing the position. But what happens is you have to use a faster bow. It's a much lighter sound. The only thing I would say is if you use it for strings, just leave it out of the bass part. It's not going to make much difference. Put 3 keys. Same thing happens. But it's used more than nothing to last for a long time. Oh, okay, Strauss is kind of an example of the extension, which is very effective. With a ninth century time, what you see is an extension of the melodic line, and then you have to jump it out to the going that's kind of where it is today. And without it, which in most audition centers is usually the case. Third movement of Mahler's First Symphony. It's a very famous solo on every audition that they play because it looks very simple, and essentially it is, but it's incredibly difficult. It lies at that place and you can play the mute for the one guy is edging you with, it's so hard to cut through. You've got a large group, but the rest of you are the rest of the bass players, and you've got this thing going. And it is kind of a one guy plays it on an instrument that doesn't speak very well and sticks it down and make it sound. But that's a real good example of the music. Because it is, well, it gives you the darkest feeling. That's a little too blurry, like that, not great. It really is. And now my least favorite excerpt that is on every recording of every music excerpt, the always give the bass players, which are all good sound. The elephant, the rattling, humming sound from Sanfon to Connolly and most which I take great exception from. I'd rather do something else, but this is a little bit. here's another thing where typically you have a reserve and it's flat. Well, it's more gravelly and bumpy if you slide up to the front. So that's generally the way it's done. Our big claim to fame, isn't that exciting? That's as bad as when they have violin examples that are some squeaky thing way up at the top of the instrument. They're playing this for fifth graders, and the kids go screaming home to their mother. Yeah, you never want to play an instrument again. So what do? You give them the elephant for bass playing.
Okay, do you have any questions? Because we're almost out of time. Anything that you might want to know about? Collegno?
I apologize. I forgot that. Collegno just means with wood, which is what the bow's made out of. So now some people don't like smacking $1,500 bows on their strings, so they'll bring their $150 fiberglass bow and do the same thing. But that's what Collegno is. It works very well. Again, another effect. You get 40 people doing it. It works very well. That last excerpt on 26. Figure out. I mean, he's talking about bowing on the tailpiece. I don't hear much. Bow behind it. I've done this a lot. I mean, 20th century stuff. This gets a real nice sound because not everybody's the same pitch, so it's a real mess. I mean, it really works well. But the left-handed stuff, and I was trying to figure this with his thumb, but he was doing this as well. Going up and down like this. Just lots of fun.
I have to go on.
I know, I
It's
apologize.
almost phenomenal. Thanks, I'm very good.
Oh, shoot.
Gosh, it's wonderful what you're doing. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, can I have your attention for just a few moments? The first thing I'm going to do is pass out some sheets that deal with the woodwinds.
and then just gradually. Okay, that's terrific. Thank you very much.